Please welcome your panelists for Europe, Past Tense, Future Perfect, moderated by Bloomberg's Stephanie Flanders.
That's me. This is Europe. This is the only session about Europe in this whole conference dedicated to Europe, which I think those of us who've sat through a lot of crisis in Europe sessions at various events over the last few years, it has to be a good sign that people are not quite so concerned about the future or even indeed the immediate past of Europe. We have a really interesting, I would even say kind of quirky panel in terms of the balance of interest represented by, I think, some people who have all been very focused on the political and economic dynamics operating in Europe and what they could teach us and what they might make us worry about for the future. On my far right, we have Vice President Jyrki Katainen. He's Vice President of the European Commission in charge of jobs, investment, growth, everything. It's all down to you. And on my immediate right, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who will not need any introduction, founder of Open Russia and very well-known critic of the Putin regime. Immediately to the left of me, Yascha Mounk, an author and lecturer at Harvard University. It says on his bio he's an expert on the crisis in liberal democracy, and we were discussing that would keep him in work for quite a lot of time.
I fear so.
And Howard Shaw, who you all know is a great friend of the Milken Conference and chairman of Shaw Capital. And the far left, I would probably say another expert on the crisis in liberal democracy, Timothy Snyder, the professor of history at Yale University, who's also, I know, will want me to mention that he has a forthcoming book on the road to unfreedom, which he'll be signing after this session. So if you look, I'm an economist, so I've spent a lot of time looking at Europe economically, but the economy is actually looking sort of positive at the moment after a lot of, an extra recession that it inflicted on itself, the Eurozone. We've now had quite a lot of growth. We also had some of the really bad outcomes that people might have feared from the big elections last year in Germany, France, Netherlands, turn out, as one would say, in the right direction, that there hadn't been a real shock victory for the non-mainstream parties. And yet I'd say people beneath the surface are still questioning whether you've really seen fundamental change in European institutions to protect you from the next crisis, and certainly whether the political dynamics that we've seen starting to erode the middle ground of European politics and ideals around the future of Europe and European integration. I think all of those forces we know are still there. So let me start with you, Vice President Katainen. You'll start trying to transform the economy and maybe transform the European economy fast enough to offset some of these political forces. How would you characterize it? How are you doing?
There are few phenomena which describes what is happening in Europe at the moment. You already mentioned that the economy is doing relatively well thanks to global growth, but also thanks to structural reforms done by the member states themselves during the crisis and after the crisis. Second point is that political ownership of member states towards the European project is significantly higher and stronger at the moment than what was the case a few years ago. During the economic crisis, I was finance minister of my country and prime minister of my country, and everything what Europe, all the news from Europe were only bailout package related news. And it led to the situation where no politician wanted to touch the European issues at all, because there was no positive gains to be expected. So ownership became weaker. But now it has start to develop positively. If you listen what Emmanuel Macron is doing or saying, if you listen what Angela Merkel, her new government is saying, if you look at what the other member states, small member states are expecting from the future of Europe, the ownership is back. Europe is back in politically, and it's positive news. The third point is that external factors have influence to Europe significantly. The political regime change here in the United States, Russia, China, migration issue, Northern Africa, Syria, etc. So it has united European political forces together quite significantly. Final point, we have also seen some negative trends. In some of our member states, some leaders have started to question liberal democratic values. There are some problems with some governments on rule of law, but also in smaller extent, the trend has led to the situation where some governments want to circumvent, for instance, single market regulations or single market rules. So even though one could say that this is not that serious, but it's the same kind of it's a part of the same phenomena which we have seen happening in more serious extent in some member states. So the overall picture is that Europe is on the move again. We are back economically and politically, but there are also external factors which has helped us to reshape our destiny or our view towards the future. But there are internal pressure or internal factors which are quite worrisome.
Just to push you a little bit, when you talk about the sense of European ownership is stronger, famously Chancellor Merkel has said, well, the answer to these problems we've had is more Europe, and at the moment people don't want more Europe. You think it's really the case that people are now have resumed support for integration?
If you look at the latest surveys, we have a survey called Eurobarometer, which is measuring how our citizens are seeing what should happen in Europe. The support for the European projects has increased significantly. People are in favor of deepening even defense cooperation, which has always been very, very difficult. People are expecting more on climate policies, on environmental issues, even in social policies. So actually people are sometimes expecting much more than we can deliver because we have our treaties and, for instance, our power in social policies are quite limited. So in that sense, it's fair to say that Europeans are expecting much more from Europe at the moment than what was the case 2 or 3 years ago.
Yascha Mounk, if I ask you, is this a picture that you recognise? Because when we take a step back, we also see, as Vice President Katainen also mentioned, the outsides of Europe, the outsides of the European Union, Brexit, but also Poland and Hungary, leaders turning away from European ideals. Would you have the same kind of vision that Mr. Katainen has?
I recognize the overall picture, but I would differ significantly in the emphasis, which is to say that we, made sense of a world starting with a relatively straightforward assumption, and that's true in the United States, but it's especially true in Western Europe and in Central Europe, which is that, sure, there are some poor countries in the world whose democracies might not be stable. Sure, there are some autocracies that may be able to persist even as their wealth rises, but there's a core set of democratic countries of whose political future we can be assured. In one famous paper in the 1990s, Adam Przeworski argued that countries that had changed governments for free and fair elections a couple of times, but had reached a GDP per capita of about $14,000 a year, were consolidated. We knew what they were going to look like in 10 or 20 or 30 years. I think the one fundamental fact that the Vice President of the Commission touched on, but didn't draw the implications of, is that this is no longer the case. That a seemingly unimportant election in Hungary a couple of weeks ago, in which the government was re-elected for the third time in, let's face it, a relatively minor country in the world, actually constitutes the first clear case in which this theory has broken down. Because Hungary does have a GDP per capita of over $14,000. It has had many changes of government, free and fair elections, and yet it is now ruled by somebody who has quashed the freedom of the press, who has taken effective control of the whole of the country's judiciary, who has put his cronies on the country's electoral commission, who may very well have perpetrated forms of straightforward electoral fraud. We have the OECD coming in and giving a very critical report about the nature of that election, with the consensus being that it was mostly free but barely fair. And what do we see from European politicians? they congratulate Mr. Orban on his glorious victory in a free election. And that is true, for example, I'm a US citizen, but I grew up in Germany, I'm still a German citizen, of my Chancellor Angela Merkel. It is true of the leader of the biggest faction in the European Parliament, Manfred Weber, of which, in fact, Viktor Orban's party is still a member. Now, why am I talking about this? For two reasons. The first is that Hungary is in no way isolated. You've seen the rapid rise of populism across the continent. In 2000, the average vote share of these parties was 8%, and now it is 25%. That doesn't mean that we're going to win every election. It was always naive to think we're going to win in France and the Netherlands and so on. But it does mean that we're now very close to forming the government in Western European countries, as indeed we likely will in Italy once the parties there have figured out the government. Populism is no longer an insurgent force. If you remember Winston Churchill's famous speech, that from Stettin to Trieste, an Iron Curtain is descending across the continent. Well, you can now drive from Stettin in the Baltic Sea, even further south than Trieste, to Athens in the Aegean, and never leave a country ruled by populists. And the second way in which this is important, and that very much speaks to the European Union, is that this is a fundamental challenge to the legitimacy in the European Union in a way that no European politician has so far faced up to. Because to ask European nations to share some of their sovereignty with Brussels and with their neighbors makes sense as long as this entity is one of democratic values, but only includes democratic country, and in which a shared sovereignty is with other democratic peoples. Once you accept as a member in good standing of the European Union a country that is on a rapid descent towards dictatorship, the very legitimacy of the European Union is in doubt. And in that sense, I think the rise of populism across the continent is a far more immediate and far bigger threat to the legitimacy of the European Union and to the stability of the European political order than the prospect of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union.
Mikhail Khodorkovsky, have the West and are the European institutions being naive about the developments in Central and Eastern Europe? You know, are they losing those countries? Have they now? They're no longer fixed on the path that we thought they were on.
Главная проблема, которая была, тот поворотный пункт, который возник в нашей стране, был в 1993 году.
The main turning point that existed in our country, it took place in our country, в каком году? Took place in 1993.
Тогда на это не обратили внимания.
And at that point, nobody paid attention to it.
Второй раз не обратили внимания в 1998 году.
In 98, once again, they didn't pay attention.
А потом было уже поздно.
And after that, it was too late already.
Европа серьезнейшим образом зависит от России в части энергоносителей.
Europe is very seriously dependent on Russia in terms of energy sources.
Восточная часть Европы зависит критически.
The eastern part of Europe is critically dependent.
И эта ситуация в ближайшие 20 лет не изменится.
And this situation is not going to change anytime in the next 20 years.
Угольные электростанции выводим.
We are getting rid of coal-fired electric power stations.
Атомные электростанции не строим.
We're not building nuclear power stations.
Альтернативные энергетические источники, у них есть свои ограничения очевидные.
Alternative energy sources have their obvious limitations.
Северное море падает, добыча.
North Sea production is falling.
Сланцевая нефть для Европы вещь очень проблематичная из-за плотности населения.
Shale oil is a big problem for Europe because of the population density.
Что остается?
What's left?
Российский газ.
Russian gas.
But just thinking about the situation in Poland and in Hungary, I mean, you mentioned, you know, this was the shift happened in Russia, and people weren't paying enough attention Do you think that the Western European institutions are losing those countries now? How should they be trying to respond?
В этих странах, несомненно, победили те силы, которые думают так же, как Кремль.
There is no doubt that the forces that have been victorious in these countries are ones that think the same way the Kremlin thinks.
Даже когда они Кремль не любят.
Even when they don't love the Kremlin.
Может ли что-то здесь сделать европейские, могут ли что-то здесь сделать европейские институты? Ну, я с интересом за этим наблюдаю.
Now, can European institutions do anything to thwart this? Well, I'm observing with very great interest.
Well, we can observe Vice President Katainen, who's representing the institutions here. You know, what would it take for people have discussed? Should there be measures by the European Commission against Hungary, potentially even against Poland? That there should be some reflection of the fact that we question some of the democratic, certainly in Hungary, that there's now question marks about their commitment to democratic ideals.
Well, actually, there has been extensive discussion throughout Europe on rule of law problems, especially in Poland. And we have had kind of structured discussions with Polish government on the issue. And now it looks quite promising. Polish government has decided to change some of the originally proposed legislation concerning the judiciary reform. And it shows that our discussion has had some impact. We have some tools which we can use against the member state, which is jeopardizing the independence of judiciary, for instance. And now we are coming, actually, in a couple of days' time, we will come out with a proposal for next 7-year budget. We call it as a multi-annual financial framework, to which quite obviously we will include some sort of rule of law mechanism, meaning that if member state does not follow the rule of law, then we can freeze the money coming from the EU budget to the member state. But even more important than what Commission can do is to provoke our general public to discuss about the basic values, because this is not only an issue between the European institutions and one particular member state. It's very important that our citizens and our governments are bold enough to point that you are not doing right things. If you are a member of our club, you have to respect the fundamental values and the values of liberal democracy. So it's this is kind of a test for our member states, how openly they can defend their fundamental values. And now it looks a bit better than a couple of years ago, because member states have become more bold to criticize, for instance, Poland. And Poland seems to shift their policies.
But just to follow up very slightly, and then we'll get on to the others. I mean, you're making it sound as if Yascha is right, that this does fundamentally bring into question the legitimacy of some of these institutions, that you can continue to have these countries, these regimes within the European Union. I mean, isn't there, at the moment, you've not passed that legislation, there hasn't been any action. I mean, this is a test that the European Union could fail, right?
Well, it cannot fail, because nobody can belong to our union if they don't live according to the liberal democratic values. And we have processes on this. So sometimes it takes time. In politics, some difficult decision takes time, but we cannot dictate. Actually, European Commission doesn't have a power to dictate that this country will be kicked out or this country will get sanctions, because we need unanimous support from the member states if you use some sanctions.
Well, we'll get back to that, is how you would get the unanimous support of all member states for sanctions against
that's the problem.
member states.
Exactly, this is the problem, yeah.
So we haven't passed that test yet. But Howard Shaw, getting onto the sort of, I'm interested, you know, we've delved into the politics, we're thinking, this is pretty fundamental questions about the direction that Europe is heading, despite the sort of positive news on the economy. And yet that is mainly, it's that positive news that investors have been focusing on. You know, how do you see that economic and political dynamics playing out?
Well, thank you. I don't know whether I'm the quirky one on the panel that you referred to
It was
earlier.
more it was the spectrum of opinion that I thought was quirky.
We're each quirky in our own way.
It's quirky in its selection, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Vice President has given us a really clear explanation of why we should be sceptical about the EU. We've heard comments about words like project and the fact that you need unanimity on something like this. And I've done business in the past, not very successfully, in countries like Bulgaria, where I found the rule of law just doesn't exist. So, we should never have admitted countries, and I think it's a little bit naive to believe that they have the same standards of legal system that the more advanced Western democracies enjoy. So, obviously I come from a sceptical point of view about the EU. In terms of EU Eurozone growth, it's come from a low level, Stephanie. So I think you'd agree some of the countries are now just reaching the point where the GDP per capita is recovered to the pre-crisis level. And that's largely as a result of incredibly cheap money, with the ECB buying Eurozone debt and corporate debt incredibly aggressively. So we've had a reflation from a very aggressive monetary expansion. What we're not seeing in the Eurozone largely is the structural reform that we heard we're getting. So when Macron, who's become very popular internationally recently, and I think he's doing a very good job of selling France externally, tries to sell internal reforms, his popularity in France collapses. And I think the attitude of the French is, well, we all know that we need to reform, but not if it affects my job or my lifestyle. So, it remains to be seen whether Macron will be successful. I hope he will be, but I think it's going to be a very difficult challenge to really structurally reform France. And I suppose my central point is, if we want to improve the economies of Europe, we need to improve productivity and we need to improve the standard of living. And these are the things that are going to make a more harmonious Europe. And some of the, so we talk about some of these populist leaders, let's be frank with ourselves. In many cases, they've come in because it's an anti-immigration vote. In Italy, the biggest factor in the Italian elections was anti-immigration. And I think it's just not clear from the economic statistics that immigration, particularly uncontrolled on a mass scale, will enhance GDP per capita. It might enhance GDP, but it might well not enhance GDP per capita. And it has been very unpopular, and it's allowed in the sorts of populist leaders that you talk about.
I'm always interested, though, I mean, from your sort of sceptical, and we, of course, for those of you who don't spend their lives thinking about this stuff, he's saying sceptical with a capital S, which means he's been sceptical about Europe specifically and the European Union.
Yeah.
People with your approach, when you see these forces kind of pulling, potentially making it very hard for the European Union to have a collective project and to stay united, is that good news or bad news for you?
Well, it's just reality. I mean, when you talk about a project, most European citizens still have a national identity, and people are, would like to enjoy the benefits of being EU citizens if it means an EU passport where you can freely travel, live and work in other countries. But when it comes to subsidizing their neighbor, do the richer countries, the people living in the richer countries, want to continue subsidizing the people in the poorer countries? That's a harder sell. That's a harder sell. We're seeing it even within countries. Northern Italy saying, why should I subsidize people in southern Italy? People in Catalonia saying, why should I subsidize people elsewhere in Spain? So the idea that 28 countries can come together and live with and enjoy one fiscal budget. And I believe, if you're going to have monetary union, you've got to have fiscal union. And the idea that everybody will say, sign up to the idea that I'm going to subsidize people in the poorer regions, I'm not sure you're going to get a democratic vote for that.
Okay. Well, Tim Snyder, you've been very patient. You know, we've had a lot of forces discussed here, and I think kind of an interesting discussion around the crisis or not that's posed for European institutions by the political dynamics, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. What's your take?
Well, thank you very much.
You did ask to be last, by the way, for those of you feeling really sorry for me.
No, I asked to be last so I could think about what the right adjective for us is. And I think it's eclectic.
Eclectic,
I think eclectic is the word we're looking for. So when we think about crisis in Europe, I think the first thing that's important to do is to get away from the notion that the next quarter's report on economic growth or the next election is the answer. We get into this kind of soccer match where we think, oh, if the right person wins in France or Italy or Greece or the Netherlands, that's going to show either that there's a wave of populism or that the wave of populism is over. I think we need to get out of that habit because that's a way of not thinking about the fundamental processes that are underway in Europe and kind of wishing the responsibility off onto this or that heroic politician, young or old, French or not French. The second observation, by way of introduction, and here I'm going to echo some things that colleagues have said, is that there's no straightforward relationship between economics and politics at all, ever, let alone in the European Union now. So Poland, of which there was discussion, Poland did the best after 1989 of all of the post-communist countries. Of European Union members, it did extremely well after 2008. There was practically no financial crisis there. Nevertheless, Poland is one of the countries which the European Commission has to be the most concerned about, as we've heard. Mr. Khodorkovsky mentioned Russia in 1993, which might have been an obscure reference to some of you. What happened in Russia in 1993 is very interesting. The elected president of the Russian Federation used violent force against the Russian parliament. But very interesting, more interesting to me is the way that the American press covered that. If you look back to the way the New York Times covered it, what we said was, well, we basically bought a story. And the story was, it's okay to crush a parliament because that will accelerate economic reform. And then economic reform in the long run will, of course, bring democracy. But no, democracy is its own concern. It has its own rules. And here, in the discussion, the gap I feel is between precisely economics and what those ideals are. It's one thing to say that the European Union has these ideals, but there's a risk that it's slightly circular if we imagine that economics is going to do the work for us, because it isn't. So what I wanted to do is signal a couple of places where I think the question of what Europe is open. So we're talking about Europe as if it's a thing, but what does talking about Europe mean? Where's the European public sphere? Journalism is national. Most political conversations are national. The European public sphere that's emerging, like the American one, is largely in cyber. What does that mean for the future of Europe? Isn't part of the problem in these individual elections, isn't part of the pattern that we see in France with the Front National, in Germany with the Alternative für Deutschland, and also in Czech, Slovak, Hungarian, and Polish elections, the fact that cyber interventions from outside, by which I mean the Russian Federation, make a great deal of difference. 20% of the political conversation in Great Britain over Brexit was orchestrated from Russia. 20%. One can imagine that made no difference. My imagination doesn't reach that far. So if we're going to think about what Europe is or what the future of Europe is, we have to ask about a European public space.
Can I just ask where you got the stat from on the 20?
I'll send you the citation. It was done by a number of British computer scientists. Okay. Yeah, and it's a reviewed academic article, which is the kind of thing I spend my time reading. Yeah, 20%, right? That gives pause, right? It gives pause. So if there's going to be a Europe, there's going to be a European discussion. And I think, as in America, there has to be active shaping and planning of that discussion. The second thing which comes to mind about Europe is, you'll have to indulge me for a second because I'm a historian, is history. So there is no European history. That is, stuff happened in the European past. I grant you that, right? I grant you that there was a First World War. I grant you Bismarck. I grant you all of that. What there is not is a common European history. History is taught very differently from one European country to another, which is something that I know since every year I have to teach on behalf of the European Union, European students coming from 30 different educational systems, and wow, does it cause a headache. So and this is significant because at moments of shock, like 2008 or say 2016 or whatever it might be, Europeans have difficulty talking to one another because they're thrown back to historical references which are not common and which are often entirely false, which is the other problem with European history. And I think now it's being revealed as a deep problem. The things that Europeans believe about themselves are generally not true. The common European story about Europe is we've had nation states forever. They learned from the Second World War that war was bad. Therefore, they had economic cooperation, hence the European Union. And that's why we're smarter than the Americans, because we learned that war was bad. And that is all nonsense. There's not a word of truth in that. The Europeans did not learn from the Second World War that war was a bad thing. Europeans learned by losing colonial wars all around the world that they needed new markets, and those new markets were on the continent of Europe. That's what actually happened. And the risk of not seeing this is that you don't, in discussions like Brexit or discussions about the Front National, one poses the question as if one could go back to a British nation state. Now, there may be a future for a British nation state, but there is no past of one. It never existed. There was never a British nation state. There was never a French nation state. And so what this means is that without a European common space, we have these discussions which help, this is where I'm coming back, which help the populists. Because the populists all say, let's go back to the nation state, let's go back to the 1930s. But it never existed. That never happened. It's a step into the abyss. So, I mean, you're skeptical about the European Union. I am too in many ways. But I'm skeptical about the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has never existed without either empire or the European Union. It never has. Maybe it will. I hope it will. I love the place. But honestly, if we look at history, it's a step into the unknown. So what I want to close with is the idea that if Europe is going to exist, there has to be a conversation over means of technology that we know, namely cyber, and that conversation has to sensibly make sense of the past and offer some kind of a future. The younger generation is more skeptical of Europe than the older generation, just like the younger generation is more skeptical of democracy than the older generation. Europe has to tell a story about itself, which isn't just about economics, but which is about the future and how the future is going to be different than the present. I think that's the thing which may be missing the most.
So I must say that I'm a bit surprised because the reality is completely different than what we have heard here. First of all, I don't accept any comments on populism from this country. Second, overwhelming majority of European Union citizens consider them as EU citizens. At the same time when they consider being German or British or Danish or Finnish. So it tells quite a lot that people have very strong commitment to the European unity. So sometimes in this kind of debates we are talking too high-level visions on Europe. But if you look at what is happening in practice, our citizens are expecting much more integrated digital single market. We don't have well-functioning digital single market, but they are expecting Commission to do proposals. They are expecting better capital markets union. They are expecting better energy union. They are expecting a safer and more growth-oriented currency union. They are expecting increasingly social policies, which are not even in the hands of Commission. They are expecting much more and deeper defense and security, cybersecurity policies. So people are expecting more from Europe because they have realized that all the member states alone are too weak to address major challenges. So this is the reality. Also, if I added that, can you name any other continent where ministers and prime ministers meet each other regularly at least once a month? They are becoming family friends. They are a very close cooperation with each other. And at the same time, we have significant countries where the members of parliament or congressmen doesn't even have a passport. So let me tell you that Europe is not in crisis. Europe is out of crisis. We have challenges, and to my mind, the major challenge is this rule of law issue. It's a fundamental issue, but we are not in crisis with this issue yet. And that's why we have to defend our liberal democratic values within the EU family, because it's the only thing which really matters, because it's a platform for building prosperous societies.
Jyrki wants to get back and then...
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I just want to say, that, look, I mean, I agree as much with your implied comment, which I'll now take to be an official statement from the European Commission, that Donald Trump is an unpleasant populist. But if what you're doing is to say that my good friend Timothy Snyder is not allowed to, who's a leading historian of the European continent, is not allowed to comment on populism because he happens to have a US passport, I have to say that you're a little bit of a populist yourself. The second thing that I want to say is that, having grown up in Europe, I can tell you that Europe can in its own ways be quite provincial, and the most provincial part of Europe is its imagination of America. So the tired line of US senators and congressmen who don't even have a passport and don't understand the world is a little old. And if you've actually spent a little bit of time talking to people at conferences like these, you'll know that there's a lot of Americans who have a much more global understanding and a much better understanding of the whole of the world than a lot of the decision makers in Europe. So just that's just a preliminary. But let me get to the core issue here, which is about the rule of law, about what you sort of say, well, there's these couple of concerns about the rule of law, but we'll talk to them a little bit and it'll be fine. When you look at how far the authoritarian populist capture of Poland is now advanced, when you look at the way in which the state television has become a sheer propaganda outlet, when you look at the way in which the country has just passed a law which criminalizes another historian who's, I believe, an acquaintance of both of us, Jan Gross, reporting, for example, on some of the massacres of Jews perpetrated by Poles after World War II. When you look at the degree to which they are starting to change some of the electoral rules and have packed the courts so that some leading Polish politicians are genuinely worried about whether they're going to retain a reasonable shot at displacing the government 2 years from now, I think it is very naive to say, oh, but we're in conversation with the government, and out of the 50 different things that they're doing in the country that are very scary, on one of them, they're temporarily walking it back a little bit. We're going to keep being in conversation with them for the next 2 or 3 years, and I'm sure it's somehow going to be fine. I think that Poland is far further along on its path away from democracy and far less likely to respond to nice conversations of the European Commission than you optimistically put, and that concerns me very much.
When we talk about history, I'm going to come to Tim in a minute, but just a brief anecdote. But one of my colleagues who's based in Budapest, I was asking him about this the other day. His children are going to school, and they're giving textbooks, new textbooks, which talk about the problems of multiculturalism and how Hungary is very lucky to have a homogeneous society and it doesn't have the problems of multiculturalism. And that is a textbook that's just been introduced in the last year. So these things are really happening day to day in people's lives. But Tim Snyder.
So Yascha took my response away because the idea that like we're not going to listen to this from those Americans is the most Trumpian thing I expect to hear.
Okay, but let's get past that.
But it's revealing of something which I think is fundamentally much more important that I worry about, which is the story of a European future. So I am willing to talk all day about how good the European Union is now. I mean, that's what I do. In this country, I'm known as one of the leading Europhiles. You have the biggest economy in the history of the world. You have the most important contiguous set of democracies in the history of the world. You have many of the countries that are least corrupt, that are most transparent. You have probably the most impressive density of cultural achievement in the history of humanity. This is all true, and one doesn't want to take this for granted. But the problem comes in with the story that you tell about yourselves. If it's going to be a story told over cyber, it needs an awful lot more protection than it's getting, right? Bots made a huge difference, unfortunately, in Brexit, and this is where American and European commonalities come in. One reason why it's very important not to say like, oh, we're not going to talk up to Italians because of Berlusconi, or Russians because of Putin, or Americans because of Trump, is that there's...
I'm really sorry about that.
That's okay. It's if you say Trump twice, your phone rings. Which is cool. I
Hello,
want that
Siri.
out.
Please call Donald Trump.
Yeah. But the thing which is important here is that we all have to learn from one another. And the trap for Europeans is always to say, well, those stupid Americans got it wrong, because that's a substitute for having a story about yourself. Right? The fact that we do lots of stuff wrong, yeah, take that for granted. But you can't build the future of Europe on Americans getting things wrong. You have to have your own story, which is not just a complement to the American story. And that story has to go back to your own history, right? So,
can I just interject and come back on a couple of things
yeah, please.
You mentioned? I mean, I don't know, I think we've got the oldest democracy that's surviving that emanated from the Magna Carta. I'm not sure that the empire was rapidly built all those centuries ago, so I'm not quite sure how you reach the conclusion that the British democracy was never a nation state, was never a nation state before we had the empire. Well, that's an extraordinary thing to say.
Okay, see, what's extraordinary about it, though, is that it's true. That's what's extraordinary about it. Because the empire is not a nation state. A nation state is a unit in which all the citizens have roughly equal rights. The reason why we had this revolution thing here in 1776 was that, but
I'm talking about pre the empire.
Right,
we were getting to a democratic situation before we had the empire.
Yeah, ask the peasants. That's not a.
Well, hold on a moment. Hold on a moment. Democracies evolve.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that we had the start of democracy many centuries ago.
Right.
So
absolutely.
Your measure of what is democratic and not democratic is just a line in the sand.
No, it's.
What about my second question? My second question is, what did the Russians do to influence? Other than you're saying that they reached, this 20% number, what is it that they said to the British public, which you think influenced them to make them vote a different way from the way they would have otherwise voted?
Okay.
I'm fascinated.
Stephanie, do I have time to answer this briefly?
Probably not, but
okay.
30 seconds.
So,
if you're going to go back to the Magna Carta,
I want to respect. I want to respectfully agree with your assertion that history is a matter of lines moving forward. And of course, there's an ancient tradition of democracy in Britain, without which the United States would also not be a democracy. However, what we know of British democracy and also of American is that democracy at the core has historically depended upon a vast empire which is not itself democratic abroad. The only way that modern European states have been able to maintain democracies as a rule after losing those empires has been to form integrative units. And that's why I worry about Brexit and about the end of the European Union. It's not to deny what you say, I just think that's a necessary, not a sufficient condition. As for what the Russians told the British, it goes back to what you said about immigration, which is extremely interesting. The main thing that the British and also the Poles, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Americans will say that they fear are immigrants. The interesting thing is that people fear immigrants in inverse proportion to their contact with them. So Syrians are a big issue in Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, and Slovakia, but there are actually no Syrians in those countries. Or there are, but fewer than there are people in this room, right? No, that is literally true. In the Brexit vote, the counties which were most likely to vote Brexit and were for Brexit and where opinion polls showed that people were concerned about immigration were precisely the counties where there were the fewest immigrants. I'm answering your question indirectly. What Russia does over cyber is that it pushes people's fears, for example, of immigration. So you say, oh, it's ironic that people who have never seen an immigrant are afraid of them. It's not ironic. It's that their contact with immigrants is a virtual cyber contact, and that makes them afraid, which is humanly understandable, and it's the kind of thing which one has to do in both the US and Europe.
I mean, you are, just as a thing on Brexit, I mean, you are basically right in the sense that there was no great correlation in terms of the proportion. But we have found globally and in the Brexit case, there was quite a strong correlation with the rate of change in immigration. So I don't think it was quite right. The places that had the fastest rate of change, even if it was from a low base, actually were some of the ones where you saw a big swing. We're going to go to questions about, maybe not about the Magna Carta, but anything else we want to talk about. But Mikhail Khodorkovsky, I'm conscious listening to you and the experience that you've had seeing civil society be subverted, and certainly in the development of Russia, the turn that was taken in the years that you mentioned when people had thought that Russia would be going on a different path. When you hear Mr. Katainen talk about how the European Union wants to get Poland and Hungary back on the right path, What do you think of that strategy?
Мне кажется справедливыми слова о том, что Европа – это все-таки люди, разделяющие общие ценности.
It resonates strongly with me to hear the words that Europe is a number of nations that share common values.
Ценности в разных частях Европы были вследствие исторических причин искажены.
Because of historical reasons, these values were distorted in different ways in different countries of Europe.
Потребует много времени и на самом деле много денег, чтобы все вернулись в европейскую семью.
It will take a lot of time and, to be perfectly honest, a lot of money to get everybody back into the European family.
Но часто можно слышать от более богатых стран слова, что мы ограниченно будем помогать деньгами.
But on the other hand, you often hear from the wealthier countries that we will provide a limited amount of financial assistance.
Вы будете бедными родственниками.
You will be our poor relations.
Вот мы будем стараться ограничивать ваши возможности по перемещениям внутри Европы.
We're going to try to limit your opportunities for free movement within Europe.
Но вы разделяете наши общие ценности.
But you share our common values.
С другой стороны, что предлагает Кремль?
On the other hand, what is the Kremlin offering?
Говорит, в общем-то, ваши ценности нас не волнуют.
The Kremlin says, well, by and large, your values are of no concern to us.
Вот, но энергоносители вы получаете от нас.
But you get your energy sources from us.
Если вам нужно денег, то мы, в общем, дадим. Не всем, конечно, политическим элитам.
If you need money, we'll provide it. Not to all the populace, but to the political elites.
И мы, в общем, за то, чтобы вы были особенными.
And we're all for you being special.
В какую сторону легче идти людям?
So if you're one of those countries, which direction is easier for you to go in?
Теперь посмотрим, как подают материалы средства массовой информации и сети.
And now let's take a look at how the mass media and the networks, social networks, provide this information.
Вообще любую
Or
информацию.
any information, how they serve up information.
Вот что-то случилось.
Let's say something happens.
Давайте возьмем неприятный случай, тяжелый случай, сбит малазийский Боинг.
Let's take an unpleasant, an unfortunate situation. The Malaysian airliner gets shot down.
Да? Что говорят европейские средства массовой информации?
What are the European mass media saying?
Мы не вполне уверены, кто его сбил. Это предстоит расследовать в течение ближайших 6 месяцев, но самолет сбит.
They say, well, we don't know who shot it down. This is something that will need to be investigated over the next 6 months, but a plane has been shot down.
Что говорит Кремль?
What does the Kremlin say?
Мы не уверены, что он сбит.
We're not sure whether the plane has been shot down.
А если он сбит, то мы не уверены, что... А если он сбит, то мы не уверены, кто его сбил.
If it turns out that it is shot down, we're not sure who did it.
Вот, но мы уверены, что это не мы.
But one thing we can say for sure is it wasn't us.
Кремль дает сразу людям, раздергивает общественное внимание на разные точки зрения.
So what the Kremlin does in this way is it splits apart and shatters people's focus into several different directions all at once.
А потом задает свое представление.
And then it provides its vision of it to fill the gap.
Мы проанализировали всю информацию, и мы говорим, его сбили украинцы.
We have analyzed all the information, and we can now say the Ukrainians shot it down.
Вот и BBC не исключает эту возможность.
Now, the BBC did not rule out that possibility.
И действительно, в выступлении BBC будет сказано, что мы до конца не уверены, кто его сбил сейчас.
That is, the Russians would say that, and the BBC doesn't reject this, because in fact, what the BBC has said was, we don't know who shut it down, so it leaves open that possibility.
This is all true.
Людям кажется, вот элитам кажется, что представляя фактическую информацию, они дают возможность всем остальным людям сделать собственный вывод.
Это на Западе.
Да.
So Western elites feel that by giving the public all the information that they allow the ordinary populace to make its own decisions. How to interpret it.
Это правда, но только для тех людей, которых в школе учили критическому мышлению.
Which is true, except it's true only for those people who actually were taught how to think critically in school.
А для тех людей, которых со школы учили слушать вождей,
those people who have been were taught in school, you listen to your leaders.
Важно получить не информацию, а как им взглянуть на эту информацию. Они не хотят думать сами.
For those people, for them, it's not important to get information. What's important for them is to be told how they're supposed to interpret the information. They're not used to thinking for themselves, and they don't want to.
И вот эти особенности, на мой взгляд, на сегодняшний день не учитываются в практике Объединенной Европы.
And I believe that these differences, these nuances, are something that are not factored into in these discussions within Europe.
А Кремль, естественно, этим пользуется.
The Kremlin, on the other hand, makes use of them.
Okay, we are gonna run out of time, but I want to give people an opportunity, like one or two questions if we have, but it will have to be very brief in answering them. Yes, at the front here.
Sure.
Is there anyone?
Mikhail Khodorkovsky, you famously had the resources to escape when you first came under persecution, but you had the will to stay and fight. And do you think there's anyone left in Russia who has both the financial wherewithal and the will to stay and actually face Putin?
На сегодняшний день, если мы говорим про бизнес, таких людей нет.
If we speak of the business community today, no, there are no such people.
Если мы говорим про региональные элиты, там есть некие люди, которые готовы что-то делать, но исключительно в интересах получения большей доли пирога.
If we speak about the regional elites, yeah, there are some people who are willing to stick their necks out somewhat, but only for the purposes of getting a bigger piece of the pie.
Okay, is there anyone else? I'm sort of interested in a couple of minutes we have left, Mr. Katainen, when you hear, we've had lots of discussion here about what's happening in Europe and the difficulties, and you have been very honest about saying this is a problem and we need to address this. But how does the cyber element come into this? Because you can have all the conversations you like about the nature of European citizenship, but I don't see the European Commission doing a particularly effective job getting the troll farms factories running and filling Twitter and Facebook. How are you going to combat that?
The question is who is doing effective job? I have not seen any government who would have been strong enough to resist these new phenomena, and this is certainly one of the challenges for the EU. our member states have listed cybersecurity cooperation as one of the priority areas where we have to find European solutions. France was quite good addressing cyber attacks during the presidential elections, much better than many other countries in Europe, but also elsewhere. And many member states have said, and also our citizens are expecting that we should devise the added value what the European cooperation can create in order to address cyber attacks, because it's very fundamental. It's fundamental from democracy point of view, like it is mentioned here. So we have policy on this, but solutions are not there yet. But we are working on it.
Do you, Tim or Yascha, would you want to have a final word? Maybe just looking forward a little bit and saying, okay, we've had all these dynamics that we've discussed and concerns about the forces, particularly on Central and Eastern Europe, but actually within France, within Germany, the populist rise. Where do you see it in a few years' time? Will we be back talking about that in the form of an existential crisis for Europe, or are the institutions strong enough?
Yeah, so I want to say a couple of things on that. I mean, the first is that, this tendency has gone on for a long time, right? It's easy to look at sort of particularly extreme election victories for populists and say, oh my God, they're taking over. It's easy to think of a couple of elections where we didn't win and think, oh, the populist wave is cresting. But when you actually look at the long tail, you see an astoundingly continual rise, which predates 2008 and has continued more or less apace since 2016. So I think that populists are now within striking distance of winning elections in most Western European countries. They're not favorites to win, so in most elections they lose, but this is driven by underlying structural factors. And I talk about those in my new book, The People vs. Democracy, but it's about stagnation of living standards, it is about the transition to a multi-ethnic society, it is about the rise of social media and the internet, and unless you deal with those things, they're just going to keep rising and getting more important. The second point, very briefly, is just that I think it's easy for businessmen to look at this and say the economy and politics is quite separate, as Tim Snyder said, and so I don't really have to be concerned about it. I think when you look at countries like Hungary, which are now deeply corrupt in a way that is deeply problematic to businessmen there, and when you look at the life story of somebody like Mr. Khodorkovsky, that is the best examples you can have of why it needs to be of concern to businessmen in Europe, but also in the United States.
Tim Snyder, briefly.
I would just say very briefly that one of the things that I think Mr. Macron has right is that it's impossible to have Europe without some kind of vision for the future. And for Germany and France, I think, to succeed as major European powers, they have to succeed by having a vision of Europe, not just floating along, not just hoping for the best, but actually reaching out creatively, taking risks with some notion of what Europe will look like in 5 or 10 years.
Howard?
Well, I think we hit the nail on the head when you said the two issues that they haven't dealt with properly is how to raise the living standards, GDP per capita, and how to deal with mass immigration. And I don't think the European politicians have dealt with either well, and that's really what's creating the friction.
And next time we have a recession, many of these things will become even more to the forefront. Yeah. But to the point that was made earlier, we should remember that these things have been going for a long time, and you can have a very delayed response to very lagged events. Thank you very much to the panel. We've gone far and wide, but I think we've given some thought.